Hello, my friends. The past several days have revealed a sharp escalation in tensions between the United States and the Russian Federation. This is not the kind of escalation driven by accidental miscalculation or spontaneous crisis. It is deliberate, methodical, and timed. What we are witnessing is a conscious decision by Washington to reassert coercive dominance on the global stage, even at the cost of international law, long-term stability, and whatever fragile trust remains between great powers. Let us begin where the escalation truly starts. The seizure of two oil tankers alleged to be part of what Washington labels the shadow fleet. The language itself is revealing. Shadow fleet is not a legal category under international maritime law. It is a political invention designed to frame enforcement actions as morally justified, even when they rest on legally questionable ground. According to official statements, the United States seized a Russian-flagged tanker, Marina, formerly known as Belawan, in the North Atlantic for violating U.S. sanctions. This justification is critical because under international maritime law, sanctions imposed unilaterally by one state do not constitute lawful grounds for seizure on the high seas. There are only three recognized conditions under which a vessel may be seized in international waters: authorization by the UN Security Council, statelessness, or the consent of the vessel's flag state. None of these conditions clearly apply here. The United States claims the seizure was conducted pursuant to a warrant issued by a U.S. federal court. That may satisfy domestic legal formalities inside the United States, but it has no standing whatsoever on the high seas. U.S. federal law does not override international maritime law. It never has, and it never will unless the United States simply decides that rules no longer matter. The statelessness argument is where Washington attempts to anchor its case. U.S. officials assert that the tanker was stateless at the time of seizure. Russia, however, states unequivocally that the vessel was registered under the Russian flag on December 24, well before the seizure on January 7. If the Russian registration is valid and there is no evidence presented to the contrary, then the U.S. action constitutes an illegal seizure under international law. The second tanker, Sophia, follows the same pattern. Again, Washington claims statelessness. Again, Moscow counters that the vessel was properly registered. The repetition is not accidental. It reflects a broader strategy: assert jurisdiction first, argue legality later, and rely on power rather than law to settle disputes. What matters most is not the technical dispute over registration, but the timing. These tankers did not suddenly appear in international waters in January 2026. Similar vessels have been operating for months, if not years. Why seize them now? The answer lies in Washington's renewed emphasis on deterrence, not deterrence in the classical sense of mutual restraint, but deterrence through intimidation. This is about sending a message: obey U.S. rules, even when they are unilateral or face consequences. The logic was articulated openly just days ago by senior figures in the Trump administration who dismissed international norms as irrelevant in the face of what they described as the iron laws of the world, a blunt invocation of raw power politics. The White House has attempted to downplay the significance of these seizures, insisting that they will not disrupt the personal relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And that may be true in the short term, but personal relationships between leaders do not erase institutional memory. States remember, bureaucracies remember, militaries remember. Trump and Putin will not govern forever. A future Russian leadership less inclined toward accommodation will recall these actions not as isolated incidents, but as part of a pattern of disregard for law and restraint. History is not as forgiving as policymakers often assume. What makes this even more dangerous is the belief in Washington that strength is permanent. When a state believes itself unchallengeable, rules appear optional. Yet history demonstrates repeatedly that power is never static. When strength erodes, the absence of rules becomes a liability, not an advantage. It is also worth noting that Russia's response thus far has been measured. This restraint should not be misinterpreted as weakness. Moscow remains intensely focused on Ukraine and, more importantly, on preserving strategic stability with the United States where possible. But restraint has limits, and patience is not infinite. This brings us to Donald Trump's remarks on Ukraine, which reveal a deeper contradiction in U.S. policy. Trump claims that without his involvement, Russia would have seized all of Ukraine long ago. This assertion collapses under even minimal scrutiny. Since Trump's return to office, U.S. support for Ukraine has declined across virtually every metric: financial, military, and political. If anything, it was during the Biden administration that Kyiv received maximal backing. Moreover, Moscow has never articulated an objective of seizing all of Ukraine. The claim serves a domestic political narrative rather than reflecting strategic reality. It is designed to portray Trump as uniquely decisive while obscuring the actual dynamics of the conflict. Trump also revisits NATO, asserting that the United States foolishly subsidized the alliance for decades. This framing ignores a central truth. NATO has always been a U.S. power projection mechanism. Washington did not pay for NATO out of charity. It paid because NATO extended American influence, military reach, and strategic leverage across Europe. Expansion was not altruism, it was calculation. To argue now that NATO primarily benefited Europe is to rewrite history. There is no free lunch in geopolitics. Every dollar spent served a strategic purpose. Trump's comments about NATO without the United States are especially revealing. He openly suggests that Russia and China fear only America, while simultaneously implying that NATO would be irrelevant without U.S. backing. Both statements underscore the same point. NATO exists because the United States needs it, just as Europe depends on it. Power projection flows both ways. Against this backdrop comes Senator Lindsey Graham's announcement that Trump has greenlit a bipartisan sanctions bill targeting Russia not directly, but through its business partners. This is the most consequential development of all. The bill aims to punish countries that purchase Russian oil, including China, India, and Brazil. In effect, it seeks to internationalize U.S. sanctions by force. Once again, the question arises, why now? The answer becomes clear when viewed holistically. In the first 8 days of 2026, Washington has floated demands related to Greenland, escalated tanker seizures, intensified sanctions rhetoric, and amplified NATO pressure. This is not coincidence. It is a coordinated demonstration of force. The United States does not operate through slow, incremental diplomacy. It prefers shock and pressure, overwhelm first, negotiate later. This approach is embedded in both its military doctrine and its political culture. Whether this strategy succeeds remains uncertain. China, India, and Brazil are not minor actors. They will weigh costs carefully. But what is clear is that Washington is reasserting control mechanisms rather than building consensus. Finally, we hear from Kyiv. Zelensky warns the European Union not to impose excessive conditions on financial assistance. This plea underscores Ukraine's growing dependence and diminishing leverage. The EU, already under strain, will have to decide how much it is willing to sacrifice for a war that shows no sign of resolution. In sum, what we are witnessing is not isolated policy decisions but a broader strategic posture. The United States is reminding the world that it still believes in dominance enforced through pressure. Whether the world accepts that reminder or begins to push back will shape the years ahead. History, as always, will remember. To understand what is unfolding, one must step back from individual incidents and examine the strategic logic guiding Washington's behavior. The seizure of tankers, the sanctions rhetoric, the NATO pressure campaign, and the renewed focus on secondary sanctions are not independent moves. They are interconnected components of a broader attempt to reassert American primacy in a world that is increasingly resistant to unilateral control. The United States is confronting a reality it has struggled to accept since the end of the Cold War. The unipolar moment is over. Russia has survived sanctions, military pressure, and diplomatic isolation. China has emerged as a systemic rival with economic weight and global reach. Even middle powers, India, Brazil, Turkey, Iran, are exercising strategic autonomy in ways Washington finds deeply uncomfortable. Faced with this erosion of dominance, the U response has not been adaptation, but coercion. This is why the legal questions surrounding the tanker seizures matter so much. If Washington were confident in its moral and strategic authority, it would not need to stretch or disregard international law. It would rely on legitimacy. Instead, it is relying on force, intimidation, and precedent-setting violations. Once a powerful state demonstrates that international law applies only when convenient, it invites others to do the same. This is not strength. It is systemic decay. The statelessness argument, in particular, should alarm anyone concerned with maritime stability. If a state can unilaterally declare a vessel stateless based on disputed registration claims, then no commercial shipping is truly safe. Today it is Russian-linked tankers. Tomorrow it could be Chinese, Iranian, or even vessels from nominal U.S. partners who fall afoul of shifting political priorities. Insurance markets, shipping lanes, and global trade all depend on predictable rules. Washington is undermining those foundations. From Moscow's perspective, this behavior confirms long-standing suspicions. Russian strategists have argued for years that negotiations with Washington are transactional at best and temporary at worst. The tanker seizures reinforce the view that any accommodation is conditional, reversible, and subordinate to U.S. domestic politics. This perception does not encourage compromise. It encourages strategic hedging and long-term resistance. The Trump administration's messaging only deepens this mistrust. On one hand, officials speak of good personal relations with Vladimir Putin. On the other, they authorize actions that directly challenge Russian sovereignty and commercial interests. Personal diplomacy cannot compensate for institutional hostility. States operate on interests, not friendships. The same contradiction appears in Trump's rhetoric on NATO. He simultaneously claims that NATO depends entirely on the United States and that the United States foolishly paid for NATO. Both cannot be true in the way he presents them. If NATO is essential for American power projection, then funding it was never foolish, it was strategic investment. If NATO is a burden, then Washington should logically disengage rather than demand higher contributions. The attempt to have it both ways reflects political theater, not coherent strategy. More importantly, Trump's repeated emphasis on NATO's irrelevance without the United States is not aimed at Moscow. Russia already understands NATO's structural dependence on U.S. leadership. The real audience is Europe. The message is simple. Compliance buys protection. Resistance invites abandonment. This is coercive alliance management, not partnership. The Greenland subtext fits neatly into this framework. Strategic geography matters enormously in great power competition, particularly in the Arctic. Control over Greenland enhances surveillance, missile defense, and access to emerging sea routes. By linking NATO commitment to U.S. strategic demands, Washington is effectively monetizing security guarantees. This approach may yield short-term concessions, but it corrodes alliance cohesion over time. Turning back to sanctions, the Graham-Blumenthal bill represents a significant escalation. Secondary sanctions are not merely punitive, they are extraterritorial assertions of jurisdiction. They force third countries to choose between access to U.S. markets and their own energy security. This tactic worked to some extent in the past, but the global environment has changed. Alternatives exist. Financial systems are diversifying. Energy trade is increasingly multipolar. China and India, in particular, are unlikely to accept U.S. diktats indefinitely. Both have strategic reasons to maintain energy ties with Russia. Both resent being treated as instruments of U.S. policy rather than sovereign actors. If Washington proceeds down this path, it risks accelerating the very decoupling it fears. What emerges from all of this is a pattern of short-term thinking. Washington is acting as if time is on its side, as if power imbalances are permanent. History suggests otherwise. Empires often overreach not when they are weak, but when they still believe they are strong enough to ignore consequences. Russia, by contrast, is playing a longer game. Its restrained response to provocation is not passivity, it is calculation. Moscow understands that escalation favors the party with the greatest capacity for disruption but also the greatest vulnerability to systemic instability. By remaining focused on Ukraine and avoiding broader confrontation, Russia preserves strategic flexibility. This restraint should not be mistaken for acquiescence. Each incident is recorded, analyzed, and integrated into future planning. Trust, once eroded, is not easily rebuilt. And when future crises emerge, as they inevitably will, the memory of these actions will shape responses. In essence, the United States is attempting to enforce a world order that no longer exists, using tools that are increasingly blunt and counterproductive. Whether this approach succeeds or backfires remains to be seen. What is certain is that the costs, legal, economic, and strategic, are accumulating, and history, as it always does, will render its verdict. At this stage, it becomes impossible to dismiss Washington's actions as routine policy enforcement. What we are witnessing is the normalization of coercion as a substitute for strategy. This shift is dangerous not because it is aggressive, great powers have always acted aggressively, but because it reflects a narrowing of strategic imagination. The United States is increasingly relying on pressure precisely because its capacity to shape outcomes through persuasion, legitimacy, and economic attraction is eroding. The tanker seizures are a microcosm of this larger problem. They signal to the world that compliance with U.S. demands is no longer negotiated, it is enforced. This may produce immediate results in isolated cases, but it carries cumulative consequences. Every time Washington bypasses international law, it weakens the very framework that once amplified American power. The rules-based order was never altruistic, it was a force multiplier. Undermining it diminishes U.S. leverage over time. Russia understands this dynamic acutely. Moscow's strategic culture is shaped by long memory, imperial collapse, encirclement, betrayal, recovery. From this perspective, the current U.S. posture confirms a core assumption. Agreements with Washington are conditional, temporary, and subordinate to domestic political cycles. This belief fundamentally alters Russia's risk calculus. When trust disappears, deterrence replaces dialogue. The escalation also exposes a critical contradiction in U.S. policy toward Russia. Washington claims it seeks stability, yet consistently engages in actions that erode the foundations of stability. Seizing Russian-linked commercial assets in international waters is not a neutral act. It is a signal that economic warfare has no boundaries. Once that signal is sent, reciprocal logic takes over. If commerce is weaponized, then countermeasures, economic, legal, or asymmetric, become legitimate in the eyes of the targeted state. This is how systemic confrontation begins, not with declarations of war, but with the erosion of constraints. Trump's rhetoric intensifies this dynamic rather than mitigating it. His claim that Russia and China fear only the United States may play well domestically, but it misunderstands the psychology of great powers. Fear is not respect. Fear breeds contingency, planning, diversification, and resistance. States that feel threatened do not submit, they adapt. They build alternatives. They harden positions. The insistence that NATO would collapse without U.S. leadership is similarly revealing. It underscores Washington's belief that dependence equals control. Yet dependence cuts both ways. The United States relies on NATO to maintain global reach, forward basing, intelligence, sharing, and legitimacy for military action. By framing alliances as transactional and conditional, Washington is encouraging allies to hedge, to explore autonomy, regional arrangements, and alternative security frameworks. Europe, in particular, finds itself trapped between reliance and resentment. Increased defense spending does not necessarily translate into increased loyalty. It may instead accelerate European efforts to reduce strategic dependence on Washington over the long term. Ironically, the very pressure meant to strengthen NATO could contribute to its fragmentation. The sanctions escalation amplifies these risks exponentially. Secondary sanctions represent an attempt to freeze global economic behavior according to U.S. preferences. This approach assumes that access to U.S. markets will always outweigh all other considerations. That assumption is becoming increasingly fragile. China's response is especially critical. Beijing has already demonstrated its willingness to absorb economic pain to preserve strategic autonomy. Energy security is not a negotiable issue for China. Neither is submission to extraterritorial enforcement by another state. The same logic applies to India, which views Russian energy imports as a matter of national interest rather than ideological alignment. If Washington forces these countries to choose, it may succeed in the short term, but at the cost of accelerating the construction of parallel financial, trade, and security architectures. Multipolarity is not declared. It is built through friction. Russia, meanwhile, continues to operate with a clearer sense of hierarchy in its priorities. Ukraine remains the central theater, but not the sole determinant of Russian strategy. Moscow understands that the real contest is not over territory alone, but over the structure of the international system. Every U.S. overreach strengthens Russia's argument that Western dominance is incompatible with sovereign equality. The restraint Russia has shown should be understood as strategic patience, not weakness. Moscow has learned from history that premature escalation often benefits the adversary. By allowing Washington to reveal its own contradictions, its disregard for law, its reliance on coercion, its internal incoherence, Russia preserves moral and diplomatic capital in the eyes of the global South. This is where the broader implications become unavoidable. Countries across Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia are watching closely. They see a United States that demands compliance while exempting itself from rules. They see sanctions used not as tools of last resort, but as default instruments of policy. And they see Russia positioning itself imperfectly, but deliberately as a counterweight to unilateralism. The danger for Washington is not immediate backlash, but gradual disengagement. Influence is not lost overnight, it leaks away. Each coercive act accelerates that process. What we are approaching now is not merely heightened tension, but a threshold moment. If the United States continues down this path, normalizing extraterritorial enforcement, politicizing maritime law, and weaponizing alliances, it risks locking itself into a cycle of escalation with diminishing returns. Power maintained solely through pressure becomes brittle. It cannot adapt, only react. And when reaction replaces strategy, history has shown time and again how such stories end. Every great power that has ever believed itself indispensable eventually confronts the same moment of reckoning. The illusion is always the same, that strength is permanent, that rules are optional, that resistance is futile, and that the world has no alternative but compliance. The United States today is drifting dangerously close to that illusion. What makes the current moment uniquely perilous is not the scale of American power, but the way it is being used. Power is no longer treated as a tool to shape outcomes, but as a substitute for outcomes themselves. Seizing tankers, threatening secondary sanctions, coercing allies, and disregarding international norms are not signs of confidence. They are signs of impatience, of a system that feels time slipping away. History teaches us a brutal lesson. Empires do not collapse when they are weak. They collapse when they mistake dominance for inevitability. Washington's actions toward Russia over the past weeks are a case study in this miscalculation. By weaponizing maritime law, by asserting unilateral jurisdiction over international waters, and by treating economic relationships as instruments of punishment, the United States is not restoring order, it is dismantling it. The very architecture that once amplified American power is being hollowed out from within. Russia understands this better than most. Its historical experience is not one of uninterrupted ascent, but of survival through collapse, humiliation, and recovery. This experience produces a different strategic instinct. Moscow does not assume permanence. It assumes volatility. It does not confuse restraint with weakness, nor pressure with strength. This is why Russia's response to provocation has been measured, deliberate, and patient. It is not because Moscow lacks option. It is because Moscow understands that overreaction serves the interests of those who rely on chaos to preserve dominance. By refusing to escalate impulsively, Russia allows the contradictions of US behavior to speak for themselves. The West often misreads this restraint. It assumes that silence equals consent, that patience equals fear. This is a fatal analytical error. Strategic cultures shaped by endurance think in decades, not news cycles. They absorb pressure, adapt quietly, and wait for structural conditions to shift. And those conditions are shifting. The Global South is no longer a passive audience. It sees how sanctions are deployed selectively. It sees how international law is invoked when convenient and discarded when inconvenient. It sees how alliances are treated as transactional arrangements rather than mutual commitments. These observations are not forgotten. They accumulate. China, India, Brazil, and dozens of other states are not aligning with Russia out of ideological loyalty. They are aligning against unpredictability. They are hedging against a system in which compliance is demanded but security is not guaranteed. In that sense, Washington's coercive posture is accelerating the very multipolarity it claims to oppose. Even Europe, long accustomed to American leadership, is beginning to feel the strain. Dependency breeds resentment. Conditional protection erodes trust. A security architecture sustained by pressure rather than consensus cannot endure indefinitely. And yet, perhaps the most dangerous aspect of the current moment is the belief in Washington that it can always escalate one step further without consequence. That assumption ignores the most basic principle of strategy. Every escalation narrows the space for de-escalation. Every rule broken sets a precedent. Every humiliation creates memory. States do not forget being coerced. They wait. The United States may succeed in forcing short-term compliance, forcing tankers to dock, forcing banks to freeze assets, forcing allies to spend more. But these are tactical victories, not strategic ones. They do not build order. They enforce submission. And submission lasts only as long as fear outweighs opportunity. Russia, for all its challenges, is positioning itself for the long game. It is betting that overreach will do more damage to American influence than any Russian countermeasure ever could. It is betting that a system sustained by coercion will eventually fracture under its own contradictions. Whether that bet pays off remains to be seen. But one truth is already clear. The path Washington is choosing does not lead to stability. It leads to a world in which power replaces law, pressure replaces diplomacy, and confrontation replaces coexistence. History will not judge this moment by intentions, speeches, or claims of moral authority. It will judge it by outcomes. And history has never been kind to those who believe that strength exempted them from rules.